Now that we have our sign in with Google button, we actually have no way of knowing inside of our application whether or not our sign in was successful with Google. But we can tell that our user was added to our Firebase and authenticated when we go back to our Firebase console. In our authentication, if we click this users tab, we'll see this list of users, and right there, that user is the one that we just logged in with our sign in with Google. So we know that it's working and we're getting authenticated. Now, how do we actually add this into our application so that our application is aware that those changes are happening? Well, Firebase gives us a really easy way to do that. So let's go back to our application and let's go to our app.js. Inside of our app.js, what we want to do is we want to first import in auth from our Firebase utils. So let's import auth from Firebase utils. And what we want to write is we want to actually store the state of our user in our app, right? So when a user logs in using whatever service we use, whether it's Google sign-in or email and password, we want to store that on the app state so that we can pass it into components that need it, because we want to access our current user object throughout our application. So what we'll do is we'll convert our app over to a class component so we can have access to state. And we'll put this return inside of our render. And now everything will work the same. We'll just add our constructor, call our super, and call this .state equals an object where current user is null. To properly understand what Firebase auth gives us, we have to understand the concept of a subscription. So normally how we've fetched data before is we, inside of our component did mount method, component did mount, we're used to firing a fetch to the backend to fetch data. But this is only a one-off thing. Once the code calls fetch, it won't call fetch again until the component did mount lifecycle method gets called again. But we don't want to remount our app. We just want to always know when Firebase has realized that the authentication state has changed. So whenever somebody signs in, whenever somebody signs out, we want to be aware of that change without having to manually fetch. Firebase actually gives us that really easily. So when we call auth.onAuth state changed, this is a method on the auth library that we get from Firebase, right? Firebase auth, and then this auth. Inside, what it takes is a function where the parameter is what the user state is of the auth on our Firebase project. And our callback inside, we're going to call this .setState, where we're setting current user to that user object. So let's log it out as well, just to see what it looks like. Now, when we go back to our application and we open up our console, we actually see that this is our user, the one that we just signed in with Google. So because our application earlier when we selected sign in with Google, it's already stored that user and it knows that this application that's making that request has not yet signed out. So that's why we're still seeing the object. Even though our app refreshed when we saved our app.js just now, Firebase is still aware that this was the last user, right, that got signed in with. And this is a really cool feature that we get from Firebase right out the box. User authenticated session persistence. This is actually a setting that you can change in Firebase, which we will definitely explore in a later lesson. But right now, I want to focus on the basics of Firebase because there's so much for us just to understand what Firebase can do for us. But This feature is awesome because if you think about it, we don't actually want our user to have to re-sign in whenever we either refresh our page, where we see we're still getting now our user, or if we close the window, right, without ever signing out, and then come back to our application, and again, we get that user object from Firebase, which is great for us because then we can decide what to do with it, right? Because we know that our user is still the same. And Firebase is aware because it keeps track of all the instances of the application that are open and communicating with it. So it knows that, okay, a user came from this instance of the application before and they never signed out. So I'm just going to assume that they're still signed in. And because of our subscriber here, our subscription is always listening to the auth. The auth is like, oh, I'm just going to send them that user authenticated object every time until they sign out. So this is a really great feature because this is essentially how we're able to get persistence of our user sessions without having to set up all this complicated stuff that it would normally require for us to get this. But let's look back at the actual user authenticated object that we're getting back from Firebase. And on this, we just want to ignore a lot of these values because we don't need them. Because it's a Google user object, it has a lot of stuff. But the main one we want to look at is display name and email. So we know this is that user that we just got. And the great thing about this is that now we have OAuth so easily right out the gate. OAuth essentially allows users to sign in with any other third-party service that they might already have. And by doing this, we've reduced the barrier of entry for allowing users to sign into our application because they don't have to actually go through an arduous sign-up process or remember their email and password for our app. They can just use sign in with Google. OAuth sign-in is actually a very tedious and difficult thing to set up from scratch. But by using Firebase, we got access to it with just a couple configurations. And that's why Firebase is such an incredible platform. Now, the next thing we have to do is actually understand why this is an open subscription. So, this open subscription, it's an open messaging system between our application and our Firebase app. Whenever any changes occur on Firebase from any source related to this application, Firebase sends out a message that says that the auth state has changed. The user has updated, whether they've signed in through some service, such as our Google sign-in or our email and password sign-up, or they've signed out. And then they will give us this user and it will call it. So we don't actually have to manually fetch every time we want to check if that state has changed. This connection is always open as long as our application component is mounted on our DOM. But because it's an open subscription, we also have to close subscriptions when this unmounts because we don't want any memory leaks in our JavaScript application. So how we do that is we would call a new method called unsubscribe from auth, which by default is equal to null. So we're setting a property called unsubscribe from auth on our class. And then we're going to say this equals auth dot on auth state changed, which gives us back a function that when we call closes the script subscription, right? And we want to close it whenever our component unmounts. So in this new lifecycle method, component will unmount. We want to call this.unsubscribe from auth. And that will close the subscription. And this is pretty much how we handle our application being aware of any auth changes on Firebase. I know it's very conceptual, and if you understand, that's awesome. If you don't, that's perfectly fine. It will make sense the more you do it.